Behind Sergio Leone's legendary Western masterpiece lies a production filled with near-death experiences, accidental poisonings, blown-up bridges, and a score that made Coyote howls famous worldwide. From Eli Wallach's Three Brushes with Death to Ennio Morricone's revolutionary use of unconventional instruments, the making of this iconic film was as wild and unpredictable as the characters themselves. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Fact 1. Eli Wallach nearly died 3 times. Eli Wallach, making the good, the bad, and the ugly, turned out to be almost as dangerous for Eli Wallach as being an actual outlaw in the Old West. The veteran actor, who played the fast-talking bandit Tuco, faced 3 separate life-threatening situations during filming that had nothing to do with his character's criminal activities and everything to do with a film set where safety wasn't always the top priority. The first brush with death came when Wallach accidentally drank from a bottle of acid that had been carelessly placed next to his soda bottle by a film technician. The acid was being used to weaken the bags filled with fake gold coins so they would split open dramatically when Wallach struck them with a shovel during the treasure hunting scenes. Unfortunately, the crew had poured this dangerous chemical into an identical lemon soda bottle without warning anyone. When Wallach grabbed what he thought was his refreshing drink between takes, he took a gulp of acid instead. Quick thinking and immediate medical attention saved his life, though he had to continue filming the next scene with a mouth full of painful sores. The second near-fatal incident happened during a hanging scene where Wallach's character was supposed to be rescued by a gunshot that would sever the rope around his neck. When the fake pistol fired, the horse beneath him got spooked and bolted, dragging Wallach for nearly a mile with his hands still tied behind his back and the noose around his neck. Only the fact that the rope had been cut by the gunshot prevented him from being strangled during this terrifying ride. The third and perhaps most dangerous moment occurred during the famous train scene where Tuco lies on the railroad tracks to break the chains binding him to a dead man. What neither Wallach nor the film crew realized was that each train car had heavy iron steps jutting out about 1 foot from the sides. If Wallach had raised his head at the wrong moment while the train passed overhead, those protruding metal steps would have easily decapitated him. Fact 2. The bridge exploded twice by accident. One of the most expensive and frustrating moments during the filming of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly happened when a crucial bridge explosion scene had to be shot twice because of a simple but costly miscommunication. The scene required Blondie and Tuco to blow up a strategic bridge during the Civil War, and director Sergio Leone wanted this dramatic moment to be captured perfectly on film. To make this scene as authentic as possible, the Spanish Army had constructed a real, functional bridge specifically for the movie, and rigged it with powerful explosives for the on-camera destruction. This wasn't just a flimsy movie prop, but a sturdy structure that required serious explosives to demolish properly. Leone had arranged for the Spanish Army captain in charge of the explosives to wait for his personal signal over the walkie-talkie before triggering the detonation. The agreed-upon code word was vai, which means go in Italian. However, on the day of filming, disaster struck due to a language barrier that nobody had anticipated. While the cameras were still being positioned and the crew was making final preparations, another crew member used the same radio channel to communicate with a colleague about a completely different matter. This crew member said, vai, which in Italian simply means, it's okay, proceed, or that's fine, go ahead. The Spanish Army captain, who didn't speak Italian but had been told to listen for the word vai, heard this casual conversation and assumed it was Leone's signal to blow up the bridge. The captain immediately triggered the explosives, and the bridge went up in a spectacular explosion while absolutely no cameras were rolling to capture it. Leone was so upset by this expensive mistake that he fired the crew member who had spoken on the radio, and the man actually fled the film set in his car out of embarrassment. The apologetic Spanish Army captain felt so terrible about the mix-up that he offered to have his soldiers rebuild the entire bridge so they could film the scene properly, but only on the condition that Leone rehire the fired crew member. Leone agreed to this deal, the bridge was reconstructed, and the explosion scene was successfully filmed the second time around. Fact 3. Sergio Leone spoke no English. Despite directing one of the most famous American westerns ever made, Sergio Leone couldn't speak a word of English when he was working with his three main stars. This created a fascinating behind-the-scenes situation where the Italian director had to rely on translators to communicate with Clint Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef throughout the entire production of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. By 1966, Leone had already made 2 previous films with Eastwood and 1 with Van Cleef. Yet he had never been able to have a direct conversation with either of these major Hollywood actors. Every piece of direction, every creative discussion, and every casual chat on set had to go through an interpreter who would translate Leone's Italian instructions into English, and then relay the actors' responses back to the director in Italian. This made the filmmaking process much more complicated and time-consuming than it would have been with a shared language. However, there was one actor who managed to break through this language barrier, and that was Eli Wallach, who played the talkative bandit Tuco. Wallach had learned French during his education and military service, and while he admitted that he spoke it poorly, it was good enough to communicate directly with Leone. As it turned out, Leone was fluent in French, having learned it during his own education in Italy. This shared language created a special bond between the director and Wallach that the other actors didn't have. Wallach later recalled how this direct communication allowed him and Leone to develop a much closer working relationship than what Eastwood or Van Cleef experienced. They could discuss character motivations, share jokes, and even argue about scenes without needing a third person to translate their thoughts. Leone appreciated having someone he could talk to directly about his creative vision, and Wallach enjoyed being able to understand the director's personality and sense of humor firsthand. This language connection may have contributed to why Tuco became such a richly developed character in the film, as Leone could communicate his ideas for the role more freely and naturally with Wallach than with his other lead actors. Fact 4. The title order creates confusion. The famous title that everyone knows today isn't actually what Sergio Leone originally called his movie, and this mix-up has been causing confusion for decades. In Italian, the film's original title was Il Buono, Il Brutto, Il Cattivo, which translates word for word into English as the good, the ugly, the bad. Notice how the order is different from what we're familiar with. In Leone's original version, the ugly comes before the bad. This title arrangement made perfect sense in Italian, because it follows the natural flow of how the three main characters appear and develop throughout the story. However, when United Artists was preparing to release the film in America, they decided that the good, the bad, and the ugly sounded better to English-speaking audiences than the literal translation. The executives felt that this new arrangement had a more natural rhythm and would be easier for American moviegoers to remember and discuss. What makes this change even more interesting is that the film actually went through several potential English titles before settling on the one we know today. The studio considered calling it River of Dollars to connect it with the previous films in Leone's trilogy, and they also thought about using The Man with No Name as the title to highlight Clint Eastwood's mysterious character. Both of these options would have completely changed how people think about and refer to this classic Western. The title confusion extends beyond just the word order, because it also created some mix-ups about which character was supposed to be which. In the original American trailer, the character assignments were actually switched around. Angel Eyes was labeled as the ugly, and Tuco was called the bad, which is the exact opposite of how they appear in the final film. This suggests that even the American distributors weren't entirely sure how to match the characters with their descriptions when they were rearranging Leone's original concept. The title we all know and love today was essentially a creative marketing decision that stuck, even though it changed the director's intended order of the three main character types. Fact 5. Morricone's Coyote Call vocal trick. The haunting howl that opens the good, the bad, and the ugly and instantly transports listeners to the Wild West wasn't made by any animal at all, but by two men singing vowel sounds in a recording studio Composer Ennio Morricone wanted to create a sound that would represent the primitive, animal-like violence of the frontier, and he came up with an ingenious vocal technique that fooled audiences for decades. Morricone's goal was to capture what he called the idea of animal violence in the Wild West through music, and he believed that a coyote's call would be the perfect way to set this mood. However, instead of using an actual coyote recording or trying to imitate the sound with traditional instruments, he decided to experiment with human voices in a completely unconventional way. The composer recruited two male singers and had them work together to create something that had never been tried before in film music. The technique involved having one singer perform the vowel sound A, while the other simultaneously sang the vowel E, both using falsetto voices that were somewhere between a strong, forced sound and a high, breathy tone. When these two different vowel sounds were recorded at the same time and then layered on top of each other, they created an eerie, otherworldly call that perfectly mimicked the lonely howl of a coyote echoing across the desert landscape. In his autobiography published years later, Morricone explained exactly how he developed this innovative approach. He wrote that he thought he could come close to the effect he wanted by overlaying these two contrasting vocal sounds, with one voice emphasizing the A sound and the other focusing on the E sound in what he described as a pronounced way. The result was so convincing that most people who heard it assumed it was either a real coyote or some kind of special instrumental effect, never realizing that it was actually created by two human voices singing simple vowel sounds in harmony. This vocal trick became one of the most recognizable and frequently imitated sounds in all of film music. Fact 6. A car appears in the final scene. One of the most famous movie mistakes in cinema history happens during the most dramatic moment of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's so subtle that many viewers have watched the film dozens of times without ever noticing it. During the climactic three-way standoff in the cemetery, when the tension is at its absolute peak and the three gunfighters are staring each other down in what should be a completely authentic 1860s setting, a modern automobile casually drives through the background of the shot. This anachronistic vehicle appears just before Blondie shoots the rope to save Tuco from hanging on the wooden cross, during one of the most intense and carefully choreographed sequences in the entire film. The car is visible on the right side of the screen, appearing in the distance behind Tuco's head as he stands balanced on the grave marker with the noose around his neck. For viewers who do spot it, this sudden glimpse of 20th century technology in what's supposed to be a Civil War-era scene can be quite jarring and amusing. The mistake happened because the massive cemetery set was built in a location in Spain where modern roads were still accessible to regular traffic, and the film crew apparently didn't have complete control over the surrounding area during filming. Since Sergio Leone was famous for his extremely long takes and elaborate camera movements, especially during tense showdown scenes like this one, it would have been difficult and expensive to stop filming and start over again just because a car happened to drive by in the background. This type of continuity error was much more common in films made during the 1960s, when movie budgets were smaller and directors had less ability to control their filming environments compared to modern productions. The car mistake has become something of a beloved Easter egg for movie fans, and it's often cited as one of the most famous anachronisms in film history. Despite this obvious error, the scene remains incredibly powerful and effective, proving that even perfect movies can have imperfect moments that somehow don't diminish their overall impact. Fact 7. The dog was an unplanned director's trick. During one of the most emotionally charged scenes in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Sergio Leone made a split-second decision that added an unexpected element of surprise and authenticity to the film. The scene takes place right before the final showdown, when Tuco is desperately running through the vast cemetery, searching for the grave that contains the buried Confederate gold, and Leone was worried that Eli Wallach's performance might become too over-the-top and melodramatic. As Wallach began his frantic sprint between the thousands of grave markers, Leone noticed that the scene was starting to feel too theatrical and emotional in a way that might not fit with the gritty, realistic tone he wanted to maintain throughout the film. The director was always concerned about finding the right balance between drama and authenticity, and he felt that this particular moment needed something unexpected to keep it grounded and prevent it from sliding into excessive sentimentality. Without warning Wallach or any of the camera crew about what he was planning to do, Leone quietly signaled for someone to release a dog that happened to be on the film set that day. The animal came bounding into the shot just as Wallach was running at full speed through the cemetery, creating a completely unscripted moment that nobody had rehearsed or prepared for. When viewers watch this scene today, they can see the dog running across the screen at the very beginning of Tuco's cemetery search, appearing just as suddenly and unexpectedly as it did during the actual filming. Wallach's reaction to the dog's appearance is completely genuine because he had no idea it was coming, and his look of surprise and momentary confusion is real rather than acted. Leone was delighted with how this spontaneous addition worked out, because it added a touch of unpredictable life to the scene while also preventing it from becoming too serious or overly dramatic. The director's instinct to inject this random element helped maintain the film's unique blend of intensity and occasional lightness that made it so memorable and effective. Fact 8. Eastwood nearly quit over screen time. Clint Eastwood almost walked away from what would become one of his most famous roles because he was concerned about losing his starring status to his two co-stars. When Eastwood read the script for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, he immediately noticed that his character seemed to have much less dialogue and screen presence compared to the previous two films in Leone's trilogy, and this made him seriously reconsider whether he wanted to participate in the project at all. Eastwood's frustration came from watching his role gradually shrink as Leone added more characters to each successive film. In the first movie, A Fistful of Dollars, Eastwood's man with no name was essentially the sole focus of the entire story. In the second film, For a Few Dollars More, he had to share the spotlight with Lee Van Cleef's character, but he was still clearly one of the two main stars. Now, in the third film, he was being asked to split his importance three ways, with both Van Cleef and Eli Wallach, and he felt like his character was being pushed into the background. The situation became even more frustrating for Eastwood when he realized that Wallach's character, Tuco, had been given most of the film's best dialogue and funniest moments. While Eastwood's Blondie remained the strong, silent type with relatively few lines, Tuco was a fast-talking, colorful character who dominated many of the scenes they shared together. Eastwood worried that audiences would be more interested in Wallach's performance than his own, which could hurt his emerging career as a leading man. Eastwood expressed his concerns to Leone with a comment that perfectly captured his frustration about the expanding cast. He told the director, "In the first film, I was alone. In the second, we were two. Here we are three. If it goes on this way, in the next one, I will be starring with the American Cavalry." This sarcastic remark highlighted his fear that Leone would keep adding more and more characters until Eastwood's role became completely insignificant. The negotiations nearly fell apart completely, and it took considerable effort from Eastwood's agents and the film's producers to convince him to stay with the project. Fact 9. Music came before filming. Sergio Leone and Ennio Morricone completely revolutionized how film scores were created when they decided to compose all the music for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly before a single scene was ever shot. This approach was virtually unheard of in the movie industry during the 1960s, when composers typically watched the finished film and then wrote music to match what they saw on screen. But Leone and Morricone wanted to try something completely different that would change how movies were made. Instead of following the traditional process where music serves the film, Leone decided that the film should serve the music, allowing the score to drive the storytelling and visual style rather than simply supporting it. Morricone spent weeks composing themes, melodies, and complete musical pieces based only on Leone's descriptions of the story, the characters, and the mood he wanted to create. This meant that all the iconic music that audiences associate with the film, including the famous main theme and the haunting cemetery music, existed as finished compositions before the actors ever stepped in front of the cameras. Once Morricone had completed the score, Leone took the unprecedented step of bringing portable music players onto the film set and playing the completed tracks while the actors were performing their scenes. This allowed the performers to hear exactly what music would be accompanying their actions in the final film, helping them understand the rhythm and emotional tone that Leone wanted them to capture. The actors could time their movements, facial expressions, and dialogue delivery to match the musical beats and crescendos that audiences would eventually hear. Leone also used the pre-recorded music to coordinate his camera movements and editing decisions, essentially choreographing his shots to match Morricone's compositions, rather than the other way around. This technique was particularly effective during the famous final standoff scene in the cemetery, where Leone planned every camera angle, close-up, and cut to synchronize perfectly with the musical score. The result was a seamless integration of sound and image that made the music feel like an inseparable part of the storytelling, rather than something that was added later as an afterthought. Fact 10. Wallach's improvised golden line. One of the most memorable and quotable lines in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly wasn't written by any screenwriter, but came straight from Eli Wallach's quick wit during an unscripted moment that made the entire film crew burst into laughter. The line, "When you have to shoot, shoot," has become one of the most famous pieces of dialogue in Western movie history. Yet it was completely improvised on the spot during filming of the bathtub scene. The scene takes place when Tuco is relaxing in a hotel bathtub, completely vulnerable and unarmed, when a one-armed bounty hunter who has been tracking him suddenly appears with a gun pointed at him. In the original script, this confrontation was supposed to play out differently, but Wallach decided to take the scene in his own direction when the cameras started rolling. The bounty hunter, who had lost his arm in an earlier encounter with Tuco, begins giving a long speech about how he has learned to shoot accurately with just one hand, and how he has been waiting for this moment of revenge. Instead of following the scripted dialogue, Wallach had Tuco calmly reach under the water, where he had hidden a pistol, shoot the man dead without warning, and then deliver the improvised line while still sitting in the bathtub. The timing and delivery were so perfect, and the line itself was such a brilliant summary of Tuco's practical, no-nonsense approach to survival that everyone on set immediately recognized it as something special. When Wallach delivered the line, it caught everyone so off guard that the crew members started laughing out loud, which was unusual during the filming of such a serious movie. Sergio Leone was delighted with this spontaneous moment because it perfectly captured Tuco's character. A man who has no patience for dramatic speeches or elaborate revenge plots when a simple, direct action will solve the problem. Leone immediately decided to keep the improvised dialogue in the final film, and it has since become one of the most quoted lines from any Western movie, proving that sometimes the best writing happens when actors trust their instincts and go off script. Fact 11. 3 different instruments represent characters. Ennio Morricone created one of the most ingenious musical storytelling techniques in film history when he decided to use the exact same melody to represent all 3 main characters in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but played each version on a completely different instrument to reflect their unique personalities. This approach was revolutionary because most film composers would write entirely separate themes for different characters, but Morricone wanted to show that despite their surface differences, these 3 men were fundamentally driven by the same basic desires and motivations. The famous 2-note theme that opens the film and appears throughout the story was deliberately designed to work on multiple instruments, allowing Morricone to transform its meaning and emotional impact depending on which character was on screen. When Clint Eastwood's character Blondie appeared in scenes, the theme was played on a flute, which created a smooth, controlled, and somewhat mysterious sound that matched his calm and calculating personality. The flute's clear, steady tone reflected Blondie's role as the good, not necessarily moral, but reliable and straightforward in his approach to problems. For Lee Van Cleef's villainous character Angel Eyes, Morricone chose to play the same melody on an ocarina, which is a small egg-shaped wind instrument that produces a haunting, hollow sound. This instrumental choice gave the theme a cold, menacing quality that perfectly captured Angel Eyes' ruthless and emotionless nature as the film's primary antagonist. The ocarina's eerie tone made the familiar melody sound threatening and dangerous whenever Angel Eyes was plotting or pursuing his victims. The most creative choice came with Eli Wallach's character Tuco, whose version of the theme was performed entirely by human voices rather than traditional instruments. This vocal approach reflected Tuco's talkative, emotional, and unpredictable personality. Iva Bloch Sojourn C. He was the most human and expressive of the three characters, so it made sense that his musical representation would come from the most human of all instruments, the voice itself. Morricone explained in his autobiography that this technique helped audiences understand that all three characters were essentially the same person expressing different aspects of human nature through their individual circumstances, choices. Fact 12. The film takes place before its predecessors. Even though The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was the third and final film in Sergio Leone's famous trilogy, careful viewers will notice that the story actually takes place before the events of the first two movies, making it a prequel rather than a sequel. This chronological twist wasn't heavily advertised when the film was released, but Leone included several clever visual clues throughout the movie that reveal the true timeline of events for anyone paying close attention to the details. The most obvious evidence that this film happens first comes in the very last scene, when Clint Eastwood's character acquires the distinctive poncho that he wears throughout A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. After the final showdown in the cemetery, Eastwood takes the poncho from one of the dead men and puts it on for the first time, establishing this as the moment when his iconic look was born. This simple costume detail completely changes how viewers understand the relationship between the three films. There are other subtle clues scattered throughout the movie that support this prequel theory, including references to events and characters that help establish where this story fits in the overall timeline. The Civil War setting also provides a historical framework that places the events earlier than the more modern Western town settings seen in the previous two films. Leone deliberately planned this chronological arrangement to give audiences a deeper understanding of how Eastwood's mysterious character developed into the seasoned gunfighter they had already seen in the earlier movies. This timeline revelation adds an extra layer of meaning to the trilogy, because it shows Leone was thinking about these three films as one connected story, rather than just separate adventures featuring the same actor. By making The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly a prequel, Leone created a complete character arc that spans all three movies, showing how Eastwood's nameless drifter evolved from the younger, less experienced man we see in the cemetery to the more hardened and cynical figure who appears in the first two films. This backward storytelling approach was quite innovative for its time and influenced many later filmmakers. Fact 13. Spanish soldiers built a fake ancient circus. The massive cemetery that serves as the setting for the film's climactic showdown wasn't just a collection of randomly placed grave markers, but was actually designed and constructed to resemble an ancient Roman circus arena, complete with carefully planned architectural elements that most viewers never consciously notice. Sergio Leone wanted the final confrontation between the three gunfighters to feel like a gladiatorial combat in an amphitheater. So he worked with his production designers to create a cemetery that would subtly evoke the atmosphere of classical Roman entertainment venues. To bring this ambitious vision to life, Leone enlisted the help of several hundred Spanish army soldiers who spent weeks constructing what became one of the largest movie sets ever built at that time. These military personnel were skilled in construction and engineering, making them ideal workers for such a massive undertaking that required both physical labor and technical precision. The soldiers built thousands of individual wooden crosses and carved stone gravestones, arranging them in specific patterns that created the circular, tiered appearance of an ancient amphitheater. The design was so detailed and historically inspired that the cemetery set included subtle architectural features borrowed directly from Roman circus layouts, including the way the graves were positioned to create natural sightlines and the overall oval shape that mimicked classical arena designs. Leone wanted the three-way standoff to feel like a public spectacle, where the dead were serving as the audience for this final contest between the living, which is why he asked Ennio Morricone to compose music that felt like the corpses were laughing from inside their tombs. The scale of this construction project was enormous, requiring not just the thousands of individual grave markers, but also carefully planned landscaping, pathways, and positioning to create the right visual impact for Leone's sweeping camera movements. The Spanish Army's involvement was crucial because they had the manpower, organizational skills, and construction experience needed to complete such a complex project within the film's tight production schedule. The finished cemetery set was so impressive and realistic that it continued to be used as a filming location for other movies long after The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly wrapped production. Fact 14. Charles Bronson turned down 2 roles. Charles Bronson could have completely changed the history of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly if he had made different career decisions during the casting process, because Sergio Leone actually offered him not just one, but both of the major supporting roles that eventually went to Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach. This means that Bronson had the opportunity to play either the cold-blooded villain Angel Eyes or the talkative bandit Tuco, either of which would have dramatically altered the film's dynamic and legacy. Leone's first choice for the role of Angel Eyes was actually Bronson rather than Van Cleef, and the director was eager to work with the American actor who had already established himself as a master of playing tough, intimidating characters in westerns and action films. Bronson's naturally menacing presence and ability to convey danger without saying much would have made him perfect for the ruthless mercenary who serves as the film's primary antagonist. However, Bronson was already committed to appearing in The Dirty Dozen, the World War II action film that was being produced around the same time, and he couldn't break that contract to join Leone's project. When Bronson turned down the Angel Eyes role, Leone then approached him about playing Tuco instead, thinking that the actor's rugged charisma might work well for the more comedic and unpredictable character. This would have been a completely different type of performance for Bronson, who was better known for serious, stoic roles, rather than the fast-talking, emotional character that Tuco represented. Again, Bronson declined the offer due to his existing commitments, and possibly because he wasn't interested in playing such a dramatically different type of character than his usual screen persona. Leone also considered other actors for these roles, including Italian actor Enrico Maria Salerno for Angel Eyes, but ultimately ended up with Van Cleef and Wallach, who both brought unique qualities to their characters that might have been very different if Bronson had accepted either role. It's fascinating to imagine how the film might have turned out, with Bronson's more serious, less expressive acting style in place of either Van Cleef's icy menace or Wallach's animated energy. Fact 15. Hugo Montenegro's cover. Hit 2. The iconic theme from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly became an unexpected pop music sensation in 1968 when American orchestra leader Hugo Montenegro recorded his own instrumental version that climbed all the way to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. This remarkable chart success proved that Ennio Morricone's Western film music could appeal to mainstream radio audiences who might never have seen the movie, transforming a spaghetti Western soundtrack into one of the biggest instrumental hits of the decade. Montenegro was already an established film composer and orchestra leader who had been scoring movies since the early 1960s. But he was particularly drawn to Morricone's unique approach to Western music and decided to create his own interpretation using different instruments and recording techniques. Montenegro's version featured a Moog synthesizer, which was still a relatively new and exotic electronic instrument at the time, giving the familiar melody a futuristic sound that contrasted sharply with Morricone's more traditional acoustic approach. The recording process for Montenegro's cover was surprisingly quick and informal, completed in just one day at an RCA studio with a small group of session musicians. Harmonica player Tommy Morgan, who worked on the track, later recalled that the entire recording was finished during a single Saturday session, with Montenegro himself providing vocal grunts and sound effects between the musical sections. The opening 2-note coyote call was recreated using an ocarina played by Art Smith, while Morgan added harmonica flourishes throughout the piece. What makes Montenegro's chart success even more remarkable is that his version was prevented from reaching number 1 by another movie-related song that has become equally iconic in American popular culture. Simon and Garfunkel's Mrs. Robinson, which was featured in the film The Graduate, held the top spot during the weeks when Montenegro's Western theme was peaking on the charts. This created an unusual situation where the two biggest songs in America were both connected to major Hollywood movies, showing how film music was becoming an increasingly important part of the pop music landscape during the late 1960s.